Hello and welcome to India's World on Rajya Sabha Television with me, Frank Pereira. The US government is cutting almost all security aid to Pakistan, saying it has failed to deal with terrorist networks operating on its soil. The State Department said the freeze will remain in place until Islamabad takes action against the Haqqani network and the Afghan Taliban. Earlier this week, President Trump accused Pakistan of deceiving the US while receiving billions in aid. Pakistan called the attacks on it by US officials incomprehensible and said they negated the decades of sacrifices made by the Pakistani nation. The US stance has been praised by India and Afghanistan, but China, which is investing tens of billions in Pakistan, has defended Islamabad. The Trump administration had already delayed handing over $255 million in military aid to Pakistan. US State Department has not yet put a dollar value on how much aid was being cut. Last Thursday, the State Department also placed Pakistan on a special watch list for severe violations of religious freedom. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze what impact the withholding of aid will have on Pakistan and the region. Joining me on the program today are Shashank, former Foreign Secretary, TCA Raghavan, former High Commissioner to Pakistan, and Bharat Karnad, national security expert. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Ambassador Shashank, I'd like to begin with you. Of course, what do you make of the US, saying that it would withhold all aid to Pakistan, especially when it comes to security?
Well, as you recall, this was the 1st of January Twitter statement from President Trump. So it has been taken in different ways. Initial Pakistani reaction was that maybe he will go back on this. And this was one of those off-the-cuff remarks made by the president. By all account, it seems that, well, whatever was being conveyed earlier at other levels, that is, Vice President on the 25th December in Afghanistan, before that Rex Tillerson in India, Mattis also in India, even though Mattis and Tillerson perhaps gave some different message in Pakistan, or at least Pakistanis understood in a different way. But somehow the impression all over the world was that this was the culmination of a process where Pakistan was being given one more chance to improve its behavior. And it was expected that since they are going to get another large sum of money from China, then Chinese would also have a similar interest in Pakistan to work against the terrorists. So therefore, I think Americans took it at the right time to exert pressure on Pakistan that, look, now you really deliver or we cut off aid. And this is a military assistance where Pakistan has the impression that whatever they were doing or not doing with regard to Haqqani network or Osama bin Laden in the past, that was accepted. Because whatever they were delivering, that was meant for the American assistance going to Afghanistan, which was good enough.
Yeah.
Where the Americans have now changed their stand. So if you look at parallel in India, Dr. Manmohan Singh had accepted that yes, terrorism will continue, but talks can also continue. But Modi ji came and said, no, it is not possible. And so it seems that Trump has taken a similar stand. And Indians can therefore understand what Americans are going through.
Sure.
So that's what I feel that is very real.
Sure. Ambassador Raghavan, how much is this going to really affect or impact the Pakistanis on the ground?
I think it will have a considerable impact on Pakistan because the US pressure is immense and the United States has a number of instruments to apply such pressure. Withholding funds is only one small element of the portfolio of measures which are available to them. And what will worry the Pakistanis most is not so much the financial assistance or the military assistance which can be withheld, but is the enormous political pressures and the implications this will have on the economic side and on the social side, and most of all on the morale of the Pakistani people, because in the end, the US pressure really tantamounts to an immense diplomatic isolation, which the US will try to mount against Pakistan in the coming weeks and months. So this is something which is a somewhat novel situation, although they have dealt with elements of it. This barrage being led by the US President himself is a somewhat novel situation, and to my mind, the Pakistanis presently are at a bit of a loss about what they should do about it.
Sure. Professor Karnad, Trump has said this is just one of many measures that are going to follow if Pakistan does not, take some concrete action against terrorism emanating from their country. But what else do you think that Trump is actually going to do, and what else can he do?
Look, I don't think we should overstate the impact of the US aid suspension. It's only a suspension. It's not a cut-off, because the legislative mandate is still to keep having the assistance and the aid keep flowing to Pakistan. So even the US president can't do anything about it, assuming Trump is so motivated. Now, the other thing I think is we tend to underestimate Pakistan's geostrategic importance to the United States. It's all very well to say, well, China is coming and so on and so forth, but there's Afghanistan that the US is dealing with. And that requires, in a very substantive way, the Pakistanis to be part of the military effort.
Sure.
And so without Pakistan, it will be much more difficult. It's not impossible, it will be much more difficult for the United States forces, the ISAF in Afghanistan, to operate. So if that's the case, then in one sense Pakistan becomes indispensable. For the very reason that since the 1979 and the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, Pakistan has been a frontline state, and it so remains to this day. That hasn't changed. So I think one should be careful in any way trying to hint at any permanent kind of separation of interests and so on between the two countries. That's not going to happen.
Is Ambassador Shashank, is Pakistan indispensable as far as the US is concerned, considering that all aid to Afghanistan really needs to go, or all supplies need to go through Karachi?
Well, ISAF, when it had a large presence in Afghanistan, definitely Pakistan being a transit country was important. But Obama had already announced that they will withdraw most of the US troops and accordingly other ISAF troops also. And they would not have boots on the ground. What it means essentially that they would use all other means, all other technical means to control terrorist networks in Afghanistan and also to control them within Pakistan. So therefore I feel that Pakistan should not overemphasize its importance. Secondly, recently we saw Chinese had a trilateral meeting with Afghanistan and Pakistan in order to make Gwadar port a little bit more commercially viable rather than just as a military outpost of the Chinese. Because China would not like to give an impression that they are setting up these military outposts all over the world. Therefore, they are going out of their way. Firstly, to set up direct links with the terrorist elements within Pakistan so that they could control them directly, maybe feed them some money also. And at the same time to see, they have given impression to India that if India wants to do anything about POK, they would be quite prepared to look at it to see that CPAC becomes more viable commercially. So I think therefore one should see that Pakistan perhaps is being brought within a pincer movement where it should behave like a normal country and not move in the direction of North Korea. And even now we find that North Korea is moving in a more positive direction, and Pakistan, I mean, definitely if it goes in the opposite direction, then we are already getting some assessments from America that Pakistan is becoming another North Korea.
Sure. Ambassador Raghavan, as far as Pakistan is concerned, they've said that what the US is saying or doing at this point in time is not acceptable to them. But on the other hand, they have China, who's their all-weather friend. So with Chinese aid going into Pakistan, how much do you believe that the Pakistanis are going to be impacted if the US withholds this aid?
Well, the quantum of the aid will not make a huge difference to Pakistan in the short term. The political pressure and the isolation which the US can bring to bear on Pakistan will have an impact. But it is nobody's case, to my mind, that the Chinese can act as a substitute for the United States in Pakistan, because the range, the interface between Pakistan and the United States on the economic side, on the military side, is still very, very considerable. For instance, the United States is Pakistan's largest single export destination. With China, on the other hand, they have a very huge and very adverse balance of trade. So the two cannot substitute for each other. The Chinese can give a certain amount of political support, psychological support, but in the end, the Pakistanis will have to decide on what ways and means they have to adopt to bring the Americans around, because this kind of pressure will take a toll on both countries, and there will be a certain element of attrition on both sides. But the United States is in a better position to absorb that attrition because it is far away, it is a huge economy, it is a superpower, while Pakistanis again find themselves in the eye of a storm and not quite knowing how to go about it to satisfy the United States.
Sure, Professor Karnad, is this aid or the withholding of aid or the freeze on the aid going to be limited just to, financial stuff, or is it also going to, percolate down to spares, maintenance of aircrafts and all the other things that the US takes care of for Pakistan?
No, right now I think it is, specifically aid relating to Afghanistan. But again, I'm not quite sure why it is that the Indian government is feeling elated. After all, the Americans have not brought the LET and the JEM into the equation. They, in one sense, of course, Washington thinks that's not their business. That's not their concern. If India has to deal with the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed cadres, then they should go ahead and do it, which we are not doing. Perhaps we are, it's not publicly known. But the point to make is that there is structurally a situation in the United States where the State Department is on one side, perhaps more, reflecting more Trump's biases, anti-Muslim you may call it or whatever. And then there are people like Mattis in Pentagon and McMaster as the National Security Advisor to Trump, who are both Afghan veterans, and Mattis was the Central Command theater commander. General Mattis. So, they are very aware of Pakistan's importance in carrying out sustained operations in Afghanistan. And so they're not going to be so easily swayed by Trumpian rhetoric about, terrorism and this, that and the other. While terrorism is a problem for the Americans, it isn't, shall we say, something that's going to, in any sense, degrade Pakistan's importance in terms of the larger military value Pakistan holds for the United States.
Sure. Taking cue from what the professor has just said, Ambassador Shashank, you said there's no need for the Indian government to be elated at this point in time because the Americans haven't said anything really about the LET and the JEM. So at some point in time, do you believe that the pressure is going to be applied on Pakistan as far as the LET and JEM is concerned?
Well, what I see is that the Indian parliamentary panel on external affairs has recently suggested to the government that they should now start a dialogue with Pakistan. So therefore, the reaction in early 2018 is completely different from what the Americans are doing to Pakistan, whereas Indians are trying to befriend Pakistan. The government has not said so, but at least the public opinion apparently in the parliament is building up to that extent. So therefore, one has to see that India has to resolve its own issues with vis-a-vis Pakistan. For too long, we have depended on others, that we said, okay, you blacklist so and so, you deny such and such assistance to Pakistan, but we would continue dialogue with them. We will continue to exchange because they are our neighbors. What I mean is that in case there are people within Pakistan who can be swayed by this logic, whether by pressures from the Americans or by friendly overtures from the Indian side, that it is good for them that Pakistan behaves like a normal state. It condemns the terrorist elements, maybe passes on their whereabouts to the Americans and to Afghans and to Indians and others to take care of them. And they say, okay, we cannot do it on our own, but others can do it. Pakistanis in the past have done it with regard to the terrorists working against China. But that destabilized the Pakistan government itself to a great extent. And Musharraf is still running around trying to save his skin. So point is that yes, we have to take care of our interests, but as we did last time with Musharraf also, that Pakistanis would simply help other countries to neutralize the terrorist elements. And that is the best we can expect from them. And I think the Americans should also be realistic enough that Pakistan will not take any action against Haqqani network, etc. But they might pass on, whether directly or indirectly, the information to the Americans so that Americans can take care of it.
Sure. Ambassador Raghavan, the Americans also have been asking India in the past, we've seen, time and again saying that India should play a more active role as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Do you see that happening in the near future to try and stabilize the entire region?
Well, I think within the limits of what we are doing, we will be trying to do more. Not so much because the Americans are saying it, but because there is a huge demand in Afghanistan itself that India increase its assistance and do more in terms of what it has already been doing. But there are structural limits about how much you can do and what are the different roles you can perform. You have certain strengths in attending to developmental tasks, in providing educational assistance, scholarships, human resources development. There are limitations on what you can do in other fields, limitations of topography, limitations of geography, and limitations in terms of your own capacities, especially excess capacities. So I feel we will try to do more in Afghanistan, but how much of an impact that will have on the fundamental security situation in Afghanistan, which is really the dilemma facing all the powers who are involved in Afghanistan today, is difficult to say, because you are attending to issues in Afghanistan at a certain level. There are deep-rooted structural problems in Afghanistan itself, which you are not really in a position to address effectively.
Sure. Professor Karnad, is it time for India to play a more proactive role in the region, engage with Afghanistan militarily as well, and take the relationship to the next level?
No, look, militarily, I'm not so sure that the government would be keen for that kind of engagement, simply because it becomes a quagmire. I don't want to get into it. Also because there's the intervening Pakistan between India and Afghanistan. If it's going to be difficult for America to sustain operations if there's no Pakistan, consider how much more difficult it will be for India without the wherewithal and the resources that America has to conduct operations of the kind that are needed on the side of the Abdul Ghani regime. So it's not going to happen. However, as the High Commissioner stressed, the fact that we can up our game in terms of development aid and so on can certainly be done. But here again, I think what needs to be mentioned are the shortfalls, if I may say so, at our end in implementing these development programs. I think that's perhaps what the High Commissioner was in sense hinting at, and as an outsider I can be a bit more vocal about it. The development assistance is usually promised and publicly talked about by our leaders and so on. But when it comes to implementation, is when we don't have the manpower or the infrastructure to pursue our goals. And that has been a major weakness of Indian foreign policy. Our foreign service is not big enough. We do not have development specialists who can oversee such projects and deliver things on time, ensure that the monies that are allotted get spent, etc. And therefore, just about everybody is upset with us, including not just Afghans are of course very grateful to us and so on. But if you go to Central Asia, you'll find people saying, well, you promised us so much, nothing has been delivered. Maybe they're exaggerating, I don't know. But the point to make is we do not have the infrastructure that, say, the US aid of the kind that the Americans have, where they can deploy a whole horde of assistants and specialists and engineers and so on, which is what we need to do. And it need not necessarily be just an MEA operation. It can be the entire government of India working perhaps under the MEA oversight. It can get teams together specifically for different locations and sites all over the developing world, where our Prime Minister goes off and talks about helping and initiating this and that program. We lose a lot of goodwill when we don't deliver on our promises, and that unfortunately is the case with many of our neighbors. Whether Afghanistan is one of them, I'm not so sure, because they are very, very grateful to us for giving the support we do.
Sure. Okay. Time to get quick closing comments now from all my guests. Coming back to the US freezing the aid on Pakistan, Ambassador Shashank, they have not put a figure as to how much aid they are going to be freezing. I guess the US administration will have to come out with that figure. But is it going to stop at that, or is it going to continue beyond that as well? What do you think is going to happen in the days to come?
So they will modulate the pressure in case Pakistan shows some positive moves, which we would not know. It will be a bilateral affair between the Americans and the Pakistanis. then the Americans might deliver a bit more and we might be taken by surprise. So therefore, I agree with Professor Karnad that we should really moderate our jubilation over what the Americans are doing to Pakistan. What we can say that yes, Pakistan should behave like a normal neighbor to us. Secondly, we should try to put pressure on Pakistan by this trilateral arrangement which we have developed with Iran and Afghanistan. So we should request the Americans in our bilateral dialogue with them that whatever pressures they are exerting on Iran should not affect the infrastructure trilateral projects relating to Afghanistan.
Sure. Ambassador Raghavan, going forward, what role do you see India playing in the region?
Well, I would tend to agree with my panelists that we should avoid any kind of excessive triumphalism over what is happening in US-Pakistan relations. As Mr. Shashank said, this is their bilateral issue and it can change very quickly. But I envisage a turbulent period ahead for Pakistan's relations with the United States, which will have a major impact on it economically and politically. It is domestically going through a very turbulent period, and this external environment is not conducive overall given the domestic crisis or domestic turbulence it is going through. Much will depend on how Afghanistan-Pakistan relations pan out, but there again the situation so far has not been a very good one. As far as India is concerned, I think it is very clear that we have to deal with our issues. We have to deal with Pakistan on our own issues, and no external power can really play a major role or a helpful role in this. But I see limitations on what we can do given the fact that Pakistan itself internally is right now in a somewhat transition mode.
Sure. And Professor Karnad, close the show for us with what role do you see China playing as as the US backs off from Pakistan?
Well, look, China has always been the terminal spoiler of just about everything. Now, basically, it's trying to upend the Americans, both in Korea at that end and perhaps in Afghanistan, by clandestinely supporting whatever Taliban factions there are to support. I think China is one of those countries that are determined in getting the upper hand wherever there's a US role involved, just to show America up, make life difficult for the United States, and show itself as shall we say, the savior in some sense of the region, Pakistan in one sense, Afghanistan, because China has come out and said that we'll give aid to Kabul regime, and they can match it because they have the resources. They have promised a CPEC which is $56 billion to Pakistan. So they have the money, they mean to use it and mean to deploy all the resources to strengthen their own position in this region, Southern Asia and South Asia more particularly. And I think they see, they are the most strategic minded of any country, at least in this play of nations in our region. We don't seem to have great strategic foresight at all. Pakistanis have their own problems and they're even less inclined to think strategically. So that leaves China and the United States. Now the United States, as Richard Haas, a former director, policy planning in the State Department, said is a fading power. It is a fading power. Under Trump, moreover, it doesn't have the will or the wealth to pursue its goals, expansionist or expansive goals. So the imperial America is history. Let's be clear about it. Now, who's to take the place? There's vacuum there, and I think China is trying to gallop into position to occupy that space, and that's very, very dangerous for India. And we have to be really very much more canny about dealing with China, rather than be preoccupied and be distracted by Pakistan as we have been for the last 50 odd years.
This vacuum that Professor is speaking about, Ambassador Shashank, do you believe that India has scope to fill that vacuum at some point in time?
Oh yes, definitely. I think gradually we have started moving in that direction, and more countries are telling us that it is just not balanced enough for Asia or Asia-Africa if Chinese are the only ones which are giving the money and acquiring assets everywhere. They would very much like to have India in the game, and we are getting that encouragement from everyone.
But can India do it single-handedly, or are we going to see more of the Quad kind of alliances in the near future?
Quad kind of alliances, and then we have to change our own system, as Professor Karnad said, that whether it is the MEA or whether it is whatever system we develop, but there must be a system for aid delivery and matching your words with action.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. You can send us your feedback as well at indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. That's it from me. See you again next time.